Hello, everyone, and welcome to Breakout Session 4, Developing Positive Racial Identity in Young Black Children. I'm Caitlin Lennon, Communications and Policy Specialist at the Crane Center for Early Childhood Research and Policy. This afternoon, we are joined by Medina Jackson, Director of Engagement at PRIDE at the University of Pittsburgh, which stands for Positive Racial Identity Development in Early Education. Working towards positive racial identity development in early education, PRIDE helps parents, caregivers, educators, and community leaders learn about the many ways race impacts young children and helps them understand the importance of discussing race with children. We are also joined by Dr. Brian L. Wright, author of The Brilliance of Black Boys, Cultivating School Success in the Early Grades, Associate Professor and Program Coordinator of Early Childhood Education in the Department of Instruction and Curriculum Leadership, and coordinator of the middle school cohort of the African American Male Academy at the University of Memphis. Dr. Wright's research and publications examine high-achieving African American males in urban schools pre-K to 12, racial ethnic identity development of boys and young men of color, African American males as early childhood education teachers, and teacher identity development. I'm now going to turn my camera off. You'll see me in the chat where I will put a few housekeeping items for us today, and I will now turn it over to our first speaker, Medina Jackson.
All right, good afternoon, everyone. I'm so happy to be here with you all to talk about the work that we do and this topic around developing positive racial identity in young Black children. So I want to start off on a personal note, and I'd like to share a poem with you. In addition to being the Director of Engagement for PRIDE, I'm also a mother. I'm also a spoken word and hip hop artist, and so I try to bring all of that to the work that I do. So here's a poem. There once was a little Black girl with long sandy brown hair and skin the color of cinnamon toast and brown sugar. That's what her mama called her bubbling brown sugar. There once was a little Black girl with a smile that could bounce off walls and open up the sky, and infinite possibility in her heart and mind. But as she grew, it began. In the car ride on her way to school, beneath her and her mama's pleasant banter, the closer they got to those familiar gates, that courtyard, that church on the left-hand side. All of the possibility was replaced with a familiar anxiety. And every day of the week, she walked that courtyard slowly, trying to prolong what she knew was inevitable inside that school building. See, this little Black girl didn't know she was as beautiful as blossoming cherry trees, because all she retained was the cruel refrain of weaponized chants. Flat-nosed freak, flat-nosed freak. She didn't know of the majestic heights she would reach. All she knew was her facial features didn't represent what beauty could be. She had never seen a face like hers adorned on TV, not in Miss America pageants or Malibu Barbie. And she felt herself disintegrating, outside in, dig by dig. Imagine what goes through a young child's mind when they are unable to find their own reflection, their skin tone, their hair texture, their wide nose, their full lips. One word, invisible. How can you love what you don't see? She swallowed a sea of tears for years, wading through the echo chamber of their cruel laughter, rippling, reverberating. Each word was a burn, each hurt left a scar, each cut penetrated the essence of how she saw herself. Now, as you may have guessed, that bubbling brown sugar little Black girl was me. And as much as I wanted to love myself, there was this confusing layer of complexity, because who I was racially bullied by were kids who looked just like me. My mama was my Black Madonna savior, and eventually I encountered an educator later who saw the value in all of me, teaching me to see it in myself. Each word healing a wound, each hug repairing the gaping holes of rejection that pierced me like bullets. Over the years, as a teenager, I learned that my melanated roots carry the heritage of ancient baobab trees, that this nose was a sight to behold like the majesty of the Sphinx. Learned to embrace this exquisitely designed face, and like Kendrick said, I got royalty inside my DNA. I had to break down the lie, restructure this life. Now feeling like I can reach the heights of Mount Everest, my Black girl magic dissolving internalized racial inferiority, every shade of Black worn like valiant armor, like the power of rolling thunder. No longer suffocated by the self-hate I was fed by the polluted air of racism we all breathe. No, my Blackness is the vastness of 63,800,000 square miles of Pacific Ocean and as endless as the night sky. I finally learned how to glow up from the inside, but now I know, looking back, that what this little Black girl needed was pride. All right. So thank you for listening. I'm now going to share my screen. And it is that personal story and journey that fuels the work that I do. Okay. All right. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about pride. First, I want to start off with some definitions just for some shared language. So we define racial identity as self-perception and sense of belonging to a group, how you define and describe yourself, how you distinguish yourself from other racial and ethnic groups. And then we look at positive racial identity. When young children have positive racial identity, they own and embrace their racial heritage with dignity. They're comfortable with their racial and ethnic heritage and understand the characteristics they share with their biological family extend to people who make up their larger racial family. So just a little bit about our journey. So we're a program out of the University of Pittsburgh's Office of Child Development within the School of Education. So we started off as Ready Freddy, and we did kindergarten transition and attendance work across the city of Pittsburgh. And we began thinking about race and the intersection of race and early childhood and how nobody was really talking about that. And this is back in 2015. And so we began looking at research around race and early childhood, and we found this concept of positive racial identity. We created the Race and Early Childhood Collaborative, which was made of 3 entities from the School of Education at Pitt. And we developed and released an environmental scan that's in this graphic here that you see on this slide to your right that you can find on our website at racepride.pitt.edu, which contains a literature review, curriculum review, classroom observations, educator focus groups and surveys, parent focus groups and surveys. And we talked to a lot of local and national key informants. And it really just came down to these recommendations where we knew and saw there was a need for more resources and language for educators, practitioners, and parents around race and how to have conversations about race and building cultural spaces that affirm positive racial identity. And then we also wanted to focus specifically on African American children. And we knew that there needed to be more of a community education and conversation around race and early childhood, as well as more research and policy recommendations needed. And so from this work and the scan, the Pride program was born and fully funded in 2017. So some of our inspirations for this work, excuse me, are as follows. So one is the negative messaging that Black children are not as intelligent, they're not as lovable or worthy of love, and they're not as brilliant as they are. Dr. Beverly Tatum talks about the smog, talks about the negative messaging around race and racism as a smog that we all breathe in. And though we may not always be able to see it all the time, we're steadily breathing it in, and it determines what we're breathing out and what we're putting into society. Then we also know that young children are not colorblind and they notice difference early. So there's a great article by Dr. Erin Winkler by the same name, Young Children Are Not Colorblind, which really goes into detail about this. Next, some of our inspirations come from colorism, which is discrimination and bias based on skin color, usually discriminating more against people with darker skin tones. Texturism, related to discrimination and bias against more tightly coiled and kinkier hair textures. And then featureism, so just like I talked about in my poem, how children tease me, tease me for my nose. Featureism is discrimination and bias based on facial features, broad nose and broad lips, and how those facial features are not affirmed in society as beautiful. We also looked at the Office of Civil Rights Data's on racial disparities, where Black and brown children make up 18% of the pre-K population, but 48% of children suspended once or more. And then we also were inspired by the doll study, of course, by Dr. Mamie and Kenneth Clark, where they conducted experiments with identical dolls except for skin color to study the impact of segregation on Black children, which informed the Brown versus Board of Education legislation to desegregate schools. And in this study, the majority of children preferred the white dolls to Black dolls and assigned negative qualities to Black dolls. And this experiment has been repeated over time, even into the 2000s, with similar results. So when children have positive racial identity, there are benefits. So for younger children, they have improved behavior, improved problem-solving skills, and the retention of factual knowledge. And then for older kids, they have higher self-efficacy, higher resilience, test scores, self-esteem, grades, and GPA. So it's a foundational, we see it as a foundational piece of children's social, emotional, and academic development. So in terms of the components of our program, so Pride is a positive, holistic approach that works with the primary adults in young children's lives, those adults being artists, parents and caregivers, educators and community professionals, to build their knowledge and skills around racial awareness, development and socialization to disrupt the impact of racism on young children in America, specifically. At least that's where this work has started. So we want young Black children to feel good about being Black and develop their beautiful Black brilliance, and believe the adults in their lives are the key to that happening. So in terms of our purpose is to support the development of young African American children's positive racial identity, to increase adult knowledge and skills in building young Black children's positive racial identity, and supporting their positive racial socialization. That's our parents and caregiver specific approach. And then to increase the awareness of the significance of race in the lives of African American children. And so we do this in 5 ways. We build parent skills through our parent village, and that's an implementation of a parent-child curriculum based on core child development needs that helps parents understand race in their own racial journeys, culture, racial identity, and socialization that supports parents in building pride in their children. So these are really fun sessions that have a lot going on. We build teacher and professional skills through professional development, where we explore the intersections of race in institutions, as well as help teachers, staff, administrators build their ability to support positive racial identity development in young children. And not only do we do this with other people, but we're continuously learning ourselves through the Pride program and through the Office of Child Development. We're going through our own internal training and striving to practice what we preach and walk what we talk. We incorporate the arts through neighborhood-based pop-up mini art festivals, which are really fun events. They're traveling art festivals designed to develop pride in young children using Africana arts, as well as enhancing artists' early childhood knowledge and skills, and build teacher pride skills. And we also want to enable the integration of pride activities in early childhood classrooms. So these festivals serve a variety of purposes, but it's a culturally immersive space where young children and their families get engaged in pride activities, as well as just broader age and developmentally appropriate activities that children like. We educate the community through our speaker series by bringing in local and national scholars to talk about the intersection of race and young children. And then attached to that is an educator cohort that is kind of like a professional learning community. And then lastly, building on the research. So everything that we do is evaluated, and through that evaluation, it kind of determines if we're meeting our goals, if we're meeting our needs, and it allows us to share our findings and resources for project replication and to inspire future pride efforts. Okay. So that's a little bit about us, more about us on our website. We also have a great podcast that you can find on our website, In My Skin. We just recently did a series focusing explicitly on implicit bias, so I urge everyone to check that out. So just a little bit about the ages and stages of racial awareness. So as you can see, different things are happening at different ages, but the literature is clear that young children are already processing racial differences As early as age 3 months, infants who are shown pictures of a variety of faces visually categorize them by race and gender and show a preference for faces of the race and gender they encounter most often, typically their own race and the gender of their primary caregiver. But then by 9 months, children lose the ability to distinguish facial features of unfamiliar races, but are able to retain that ability when regularly shown picture books with faces of other races. Then at 2 years, children use racial categories to make sense of others' behaviors. And then social biases in children begin to form as early as 3 to 5 years, with 3-year-olds attributing more positive traits to the dominant societal race and 5-year-olds attributing negative traits to non-dominant races. So, and then as children get older, these ideas and messaging around race, they become more crystallized and they become more internalized, which we really find why it's so significant to talk about race and engage in race affirming activities early, because the older children get, the harder it is to, though they're still flexible, the harder it is to kind of change their minds. But in the older ages, they're also able to engage more critical thinking as well. So there are also opportunities to disrupt some of the thinking. And then lastly, this slide talks about what grown-ups can do based on the different ages and stages, particularly when you're thinking about quality care settings. But I wanted to end on, I started with something personal. I want to end with a personal experience, not personal to me, but I'd like for you to just hear from a kindergarten teacher and her strategies for talking about race in the classroom, just so you can get a sense of kind of what these things can look like when they're brought to life. So the first step was to build a classroom library that included books about children of all different skin colors and types of hair, as well as books that teach children how we get the skin color we have, like The Skin You Live In, All the Colors We Are, The Story of How We Get Our Skin Color. Now I begin the year reading these books and leading open conversations about skin color, in which I answer many questions my students have about why we are the way we are. Once I open up the conversation, I am amazed by how curious and eager my kindergartners are to gain a better understanding of their own racial identity and the racial identity of their classmates. The next was to integrate this unit on skin color into other aspects of our curriculum, including art, writing, and humanities. We mix paint to find our skin tones, use paint chips to compare these colors, and come up with interesting and poetic names for our skin, and write poems about our skin. Together with the kindergarten team of teachers at my school, we developed an art poetry unit on the color brown in an effort to give students new and positive associations with a color that is often left out of poems and songs for children. We give our students coffee, nutmeg, chai, cinnamon, and cloves, and have them touch and smell the spices, and then write poems about the color brown. The conversation about race and skin color cannot be divorced from the conversation about racism, even though talking about racism can be even more challenging and uncomfortable for teachers. For me, this realization came about when it came to talk about Martin Luther King Jr. in my classroom. For years, I tried to tell my students about his ideas and contributions to social justice and inclusion without also telling them about the reality of racism in our country. I didn't know how much to say to young children, and again, I worried that learning this information would create divisions in my room rather than lead to greater unity. But I came to realize that without the story of racism, the themes I wanted my students to understand, themes of social justice, inclusion, and peaceful change, had no real meaning. And so I had to face my resistance to telling the ugly truth of racism to my students. And she closes with, I did this by first integrating the themes of peaceful change and standing up for a community into our humanities unit on native trees and environmentalism. We studied people who made change by protecting habitats and replanting trees, and gave our students key questions to consider as they thought about these change makers. By the time it came to talk about Dr. King and the problems he faced, my students had had months of practice exploring the ideas around change, making through peaceful means. This, combined with their deeper understanding of skin color and race, led to a more inclusive and unified experience discussing Dr. King than had ever happened in my 13 years of teaching young children. So with that, I will turn it over to Dr. Wright. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Medina Jackson. What a powerful poem, and I'm amazed at the synergy and the connections across our presentations. And so I'm excited to share my screen at this time and to talk to you about the developing positive racial identity in young Black boys. And so this is a part of my work, and it's really important that we think about the experiences of Black children, both girls and boys, but for the purposes of my presentation, I will focus on the racial identity development of Black boys. And so I want to start with what Black boys are not, in part because the experiences of Black boys are often circumscribed by their race and by their gender inside and outside of classrooms. And so being Black and a boy is not a risk factor. Being Black and a boy is not a troublemaker. Being Black and a boy is not a bad boy. Being Black and a boy is not a problem to be managed. Being Black and a boy is not a school to prison pipeline. Being Black and a boy is not an anti-intellectual. Being Black and a boy is not destined for trouble. Being Black and a boy is brilliant. And so I really think that in order to challenge the narrative that is often the case for Black and brown boys, both in and outside of school, we must re-language the way in which we frame and talk about this population, which is frequently from a point of deficit and often seeing them for what they're not, as opposed to all the things that they are. And so this is a counter narrative, but I want to provide a context for you in terms of what the schooling, teaching, and learning experiences tend to be for Black boys. And if, in order for us to cultivate their healthy racial ethnic identity, agency, and voice, it's going to be important for us as educators to begin to challenge the ways in which we think, write, and talk about this population. And so Black boyhood interrupted and disrupted in early childhood. And so the experiences often of Black boys are filled with negative stereotypes that begin as early as preschool and kindergarten. And so there are two terms that often populate the literature when talking about Black boys' behavior. They're often seen as older than they really are, so they're adultified, and they're often suspect and seen in very problematic ways. So they're criminalized in ways that begin to see them often as the troublemaker, the bad boy, and a problem to be fixed. And so this sort of racialized and gendered experience that Black boys have inside of classrooms, it has a long and short-term effect on them. And so Black boys begin to get the message early as preschool that schools are places, or classrooms are places, where they are watched and not welcomed. So again, schools become places and spaces where Black boys are watched and they're not welcome. And so we need to change that. And so often for Black boys, their early schooling experiences are described as these sort of discipline hubs. They find themselves in classrooms where they are often not viewed with the same light of needing nurturing and care and protection that we provide to other children inside of classrooms. And so you can see from the slide that there are some interesting trends that are supported by both anecdotal and empirical evidence that preschoolers are expelled at 3 times the rate of other groups, K through 12. And so you have to ask the question, what is happening for a 4-year-old or a 3-year-old that is resulting in not just suspension, but expulsion, which this is a very unique and special time for children as they are actualizing their big ideas. And so I also often cite the Office for Civil Rights research data that's a part of the US Department of Education. And as you can see that while Black boys represent only 19% of the preschool enrollment, they represent 45% of preschool children receiving 1 or more out of school suspensions. And so that's an alarming amount of suspensions and expulsions that are happening for Black boys. And so typically when these kinds of things happen, we locate the problems and the pathologies with the child, their family, and their community. But we've got to ask some other kinds of questions, and that is, what are we doing in teacher preparation programs? What are we doing to challenge teachers to not just be steeped in content and have sophisticated pedagogical practices, but how are we preparing them to interrogate their own attitudes, their beliefs, their values, and how those manifest in problematic practices? And so how do we create culturally competent teachers to work with other people's children? And in this case, working with Black and brown children, boys, in this case in particular. And so, as I said from the outset, race and gender tends to circumscribe the experiences of Black boys, and we see evidence of this in discipline and zero tolerance, where Black and brown children are overrepresented in these areas. We also see the disproportionality in terms of special education, where Black and brown children are referred to special education at a higher rate, with these designations from mild to moderate, and in some cases severe disabilities, but usually these mild to moderate learning disability, emotional and behavior disorders, intellectual disabilities, so forth, and they're underrepresented in gifted education. And so we know that there's something not quite right when we begin to look at Black boys and the intersections of race, gender, and their schooling. And so we've got to disrupt, dismantle, and reimagine the brilliance that Black boys bring to classrooms that are worthy and valuable to be integrated into schools. And so I'm giving you this context in terms of what is needed if we're going to cultivate and support their healthy racial ethnic identity. So how do we move from this deficit perspective to strengths or an asset-based approach? And so I often use in my work the work of Sean Harper, who developed the framework, anti-deficit achievement framework. And in his framework, he inverts those commonly asked questions that often sort of deal with underrepresentation, disengagement, blackmail, attrition, et cetera. And he changes those questions to begin to challenge, why does that always have to be the ways in which we frame Black and brown children, and in this case, Black boys? And so we often find that even when we turn to the research that looks at strengths and assets, they're often overshadowed by the master narrative that often sees Black and brown boys for what they're not seeing their promise, potential, and possibility. And so this is described in the literature as deficit thinking, only sort of framing Black and brown students from this sort of negative place. And as a result of that framing and labeling, it results in the ways in which they're treated both in and outside of schools. And when they respond to that treatment in ways that schools don't recognize, we begin to frame them as somehow oppositional, and we adultify them, and we criminalize them, and we leave schools, teachers, and institutions somehow exculpatory, not taking responsibility for how do we need to structurally change schools in order to be more responsive to this population. And so in an anti-deficit achievement framework changes and shifts the questions from why are Black boys not succeeding in education to looking at more positive questions of resilience. How do Black boys from low resource schools manage to succeed in school? And then the collectivism, what can we do as a school community to see the strengths and potential of Black boys and males pre-K-12? And so Black boy books. And so one of the ways in which we can help very young children, and by that I mean 3- and 4-year-olds, 5-year-olds, first, second, and third graders begin to think about their racial identity is through the positive depiction of books, because the lack of representation has the potential to influence Black boys' identities around who they see themselves as a reader, as a young scholar, as an an intellectual worker, et cetera. And so it's important for us to think about how do we bring things into the classroom, as you heard from Ms. Jackson's presentation, that affirm, that celebrate, that promote the perspectives, the experiences, and the realities of Black and brown children. And so in a society where we've often viewed Black boys and men as somehow anti-intellectual, which further reinscribes these beliefs around their commitment to literacy and other forms of academic pursuits, we want to challenge that. And through this process of celebrating children through books, it allows us to develop Black boys' identity. And so here's 3 things to sort of think about: finding and cultivating a healthy racial ethnic identity and agency, meaning boys have the right to enact and have a say in their education, is looking at the history and me. And so these children's books really focus on historical fiction, and in some cases nonfiction, in which Black boys are the protagonists and they see themselves front and center in these books. I'm drawing on the work of the brilliant Rudine Sims Bishop, mother of multicultural literature, and you can see the site there, who talked about the importance of representation, reflection, so mirror books versus window books. Black and brown children often have a window into an all-white world, and they often are not exposed to books that reflect who they are, their perspectives, their experiences, and their realities. And so mirror books are designed to do that. And they also provide for children mentors on paper. And so in the process, they are affirming those wonderful features that Black and brown children bring to the classroom. They're celebrating their experiences, et cetera, and they're reminding them that they matter. And so I want to go in the conclusion to some books that you might consider including in your classroom, starting with Racial Pride. I Love My Black and Brown Skin, which is a powerful book called Chocolate Me, and it deals with having a positive sense of self around the skin you're in. Academic Identity, Black Boys Succeeding in School, The Kindergarten King, another powerful book that describes a Black boy who's doing wonderful things, both in and outside of, but also developing this academic identity. Academic Identity Continued, Black Boys and Their Ways with Words, The Word Collector, which was recently read as a virtual read aloud by President Obama and First Lady Michelle Obama to the nation, and this Black boy who is so enamored with words. And so it's a powerful way to challenge this notion of anti-intellectualism, and yet affirming that Black people enjoy words, reading, etc., and children get to see that. Another book, Cultural and Personal Identity, Black Boy Joy. This book, I Am Every Good Thing, is a challenge to the very negative things that I started with in this presentation from the outset of what Black boys are often described as. And this book is a confirmation, affirmation of what they are not, and that they're brilliant, beautiful, etc. And then Identity and Agency, Black Boys Matter, Black Lives Matter, Black Minds Matter. And so this very powerful book for beautiful Black boys who believe in a better world is a powerful book that allows Black boys to see themselves reflected in the kinds of things that are happening in our world right now in terms of the racial upheaval and the things that are happening with police brutality, et cetera. This book is developmentally written to allow children, Black boys in particular, to begin to not only see their brilliance and beauty, but to figure out their agency in terms of how they can impact their worlds. And so finally, this book, Agency, Get in Trouble, Good Trouble, Necessary Trouble, is The Preaching Chickens, which is the story of John Lewis, the late Congressman John Lewis, which inspired and encouraged all of us when we see something that's not right, something that's not fair and equitable, we need to get in the way. We need to get in trouble, good trouble, necessary trouble. So this empowers Black boys to see that Black boys historically have had agency, they have been history changers, they made a difference as John Lewis made. And so finally, The Brilliance of Black Boys, which is my book that focuses on cultivating school success in the early grades, really provides a way for teachers, policymakers, educators to think about the education of Black boys from an asset and strength-based approach. And so the charge that I leave with you are the words from Sean Harper: researchers, school personnel who endeavor to improve African-American success in education should commit at least a fraction of their intellectual efforts in studying those in the race who have earned good grades, avoided trouble and school suspension, assumed leadership positions on their campuses, responded productively to racist stereotypes, resolved masculine identity conflicts, amassed social capital they previously lacked, and negotiated same-race peer support for their school achievement. And so while this talks about older males, we can certainly see how it's important for us, if we're going to talk about the population, tell the entire story in terms of what are the strengths, what are the assets, and how do we build upon those. And so thank you for the opportunity to share my work with you on how we can develop racial, ethnic identity in Black boys in a positive way, beginning with children's books that are multicultural, multi-ethnic, and authentic, that really do validate the experiences that Black boys can see themselves reflected in these sort of mirror books. So again, thank you for the opportunity. And I'll stop sharing my screen.
Great, thank you so much, Dr. Wright, and thank you to Medina for those incredible presentations. We've had a couple of questions come through in the meantime, so I will just go ahead and start reading those to the both of you. So the first question that came through from Karen, Medina, this is more geared towards you, was asking more about the professional development that you touched on at Pride and the University of Pittsburgh, and if you could just discuss a little bit more about that.
Okay, so for our professional development, and the program director, Dr. Aisha White, she leads our professional development component, and I support her. So in our professional development, we have a few components that we touch on, and they are fee for service based on what we do. And we do this with educators and community professionals and artists primarily. Anyone who's really interested in reaching, working with, loving on young Black children, it's available to them. So in our professional development, we look at the history of race as relevant to the institution that we're working with. So if we're working with a museum, a children's museum, if we're working with librarians, if we're working with school educators, we touch on the history and impact of race in those institutions. We also look at how children develop racial awareness and racial identity as a session. We cover the internal work that needs to happen when doing racial identity and racial justice work. So we have an opportunity to explore our own experiences, the messaging that we've received that have formed our beliefs, which have informed how we show up in the world and how we show up in our work that's relevant to race. Then we look at, we give folks an opportunity to look at their specific roles. So again, if you're a teacher, if you're an Africana artist, if you're a mental health professional, we look at how race intersects with your particular role. And then we have a session called Bringing It All Together, where we try to integrate all that we've learned and then come up with, or collectively come up with strategies for how people can integrate kind of the Pride knowledge into their specific work and into their institutions, and look at ways to change the institutions that they're working with. So we do less of the work around institutional change, meaning looking at the policies and hiring practices and that kind of thing. That's less of our work, but usually we're kind of asked about that piece of it. And we do feel like it's important work to do, that if you're striving to do this kind of work in external community space, that your institution, your team, your program, and then you specifically have to be doing that work as well. So that's kind of an overview of our professional development. And then Dean Valerie Kenlock, she is our dean for the School of Education. So she is an inspiring, wonderful, brilliant, radical force who really emphasizes being grounded in equity and justice across all of these School of Education's programs and entities. So she's a wonderful leader for us in that way. And so there are things like the Pitt Ed Justice Collective, where there are other kind of professional development series that are accessible to folks in the School of Education and beyond, and they're often broadcast on the School of Education's YouTube site when there are different sessions that are happening and different speakers and so forth.
Great, thank you so much for that response, Medina. I have another question that's geared towards the both of you, Dr. Wright and Medina. And this is from Jillian, who says, as a parent, what questions can I ask my son's teacher and school to ensure they are meeting the standards of these two presentations?
So I guess I'll start. I think it's always important to find out from your child's teacher, what's the philosophy of the school in terms of how are they dealing with diversity, race, equity, and inclusion. I think asking those explicit questions are important because how does the school as a whole think about race, equity, diversity, and inclusion? But you also want to know specifically, how does that teacher take up these important issues within the classroom? And by that, I mean, how does that teacher plan curriculum and instruction around these important topics? How is instruction delivered in the classroom that is responsive and responsible to the range of demography that exists in the classroom? What materials in the classroom affirm diversity? And even when the classroom is monolingual, monocultural, etc., those classrooms also need to have those things available for children to begin to think about, to ask questions, because as you heard from Ms. Jackson, they're already having those conversations. We have much research that supports, if you know the field of early childhood, Louise Derman Sparks' work early on in the 90s talks about as early as 2.5, 3 years of age, children are already engaged in this sort of race, ethnicity, class, and other kinds of things. They may not have the ideological ideas that we bring to these kinds of things, but it's important to know that they're already engaged and exploring, so they're not too young. And so I think asking that question of what's the philosophy here around race, diversity, equity, and inclusion is really important, because I think that's going to give you a sense of how children are engaged, whether they look like the teacher or they don't, as well as how that teacher manages the multicultural, multi-ethnic classroom climate. And so I think that's, for me, an important question that needs to happen, especially if your Black and brown child is going to be in a classroom where they might be one of two in that classroom.
And I'll just, I mean, that was a brilliant answer. So the only thing I'll add here is also asking a question about, like Dr. Wright talked about how and what, and so I would also add who, right? So who are the people, how are you engaging in community? Like, it's really important for young children and all children really to see representations of themselves and representations of people who come, not just, you know, the 4 folks that we all hear during Black History Month, right? Who we value, we love those folks, but also people who are in their communities, in their cities, in their neighborhoods, who are doing racial justice work and working towards a better society for all of us. It's important that young people are exposed to those folks, as well as asking the question about how will the teacher be incorporating students home cultures and their family life and family cultures into the classroom? Is there space for parents and caregivers and family members to come and share and talk about their cultures and talk about their ways of life, as well as, like I said, bringing in other folks from the community to talk about who they are and what they do, especially if it relates to race, justice, activism, and equity, so they have those examples in person.
I'll just say one other thing too, because I think Ms. Jackson has really added to that, and she's highlighting the fact that in general, schools tend to acknowledge only a narrow and limited range of the kinds of talk and thinking that comes from children. So very often, Black and brown children, much of what they learn at home and in school at home and in their community, are often seen as irrelevant for school. And so that marginalizes all of those wonderful experiences that are left out of the curriculum, that are left out of the classroom. And so we really do have to help teachers and teacher education to become familiar often with the unfamiliar and not see it as a deficit, but simply a difference that needs to be sort of cultivated and brought into the classroom.
Thank you both. And unfortunately, we only have time for one more question. So I will go ahead and read it and let the both of you respond before we end the session. So the question that I'm going to read is from, looks like, oh, I'm sorry, it went away. Apologies. Well, the one question, Dr. Wright, is more geared towards you about the book recommendations. And if there's anything that you would recommend in particular for a classroom for 12 to 24 months.
So thank you for that question. The National Association for the Education of Young Children, they have two publications. One is Young Children and the other is Teaching Young Children. Teaching Young Children is the practitioner-based journal that provides wonderful resources. And so I have several articles that are coming out in October and November that are called Now Read This. So again, Now Read This. And so in that column, I'm recommending books for children pre-K to third, and so how teachers can incorporate those books in the classroom, and also how families can utilize those multicultural, multi-ethnic books at home. And so you can certainly go to Young Children, and also some of the resources that were provided by the Crane Center for this talk, there are also recommendations there as well. But I also have a book coming out soon, and it's entitled, another book, Black Boys Are Lit. And so lit in terms of literature. And so it's a collection of books for Black boys in which they are the protagonists in those stories. And they range from pre-K on, and it's a powerful collection of ways in which teachers can utilize these books to affirm racial ethnic identity, voice, and agency in Black boys.
Excellent. Thank you so much. And it looks like we're about out of time for this session. Thank you so much to Dr. Wright and to Medina for joining us. We have another panel starting at 1:15, which I have just put the link in the chat box for, and we would appreciate anyone who'd like to join us. And there should be a survey that pops up at the end of the webinar when you exit. So please do complete that, especially if you are seeking Ohio approved credit. And just thank you so much, Dr. Wright and Medina. Your expertise on this topic has been—
Thank you, Medina. It was a pleasure to present with you.
Oh no, she muted. There we go.
Same to you. Thank you. It was great. And I look forward to just connecting with you further, Dr. Wright. Like we said, your work is amazing. So
thank you so much. Likewise.
Thank you to everyone. Thank you to
Thank you all. Thank you so much.